Hi everyone, number one Marmaduke fan here. If you've followed my content, you know that I consider social justice to be the key philosophical dividing line of my lifetime. And I also haven't been talking about it for about a year. In the early days of my channel, I experimented with a response video format where I would play a documentary or read an essay and try to respond to it point by point. Over time, I've become concerned that this type of content may not be accomplishing much, given that it can be extremely technical and likely it's only recommended to people who agree with the perspective of the guy speaking. However, despite the negative concerns I have, I believe that the topic of intersectionality and social justice is too important to ignore for long. I think I want to make social justice research videos, but not the typical anti-SJW sort of video. I don't know what the future holds or how the internet is going to affect this culture war, but one of the things I've wanted to accomplish is a series of videos that examines a wide range of topics relevant to this problem. Rather than digging into the nitty-gritty of an extremely detailed aspect of the topic, I want to try a big picture approach. I want to try to very briefly discuss essays and documentaries that are primarily distributed in academies and universities. There is obviously an advantage to being detailed and thorough, but I think this fast, just give me the facts approach will have a couple advantages over my older content. First, it's easier to produce. Second, it's less of a time commitment for the listener. And third, it will practically allow me to cover more topics. I might return to doing the thorough response video format in the future, as my job and schedule allows, but only if I feel really confident that I can approach an important topic very thoroughly and very fairly. In these shorter, big picture videos, I'm not going to be attempting a response or refutation of the argument. Instead, I will try to give you a fair summary of the key argument or arguments being presented, and at the end, ask some questions that I think are important and might promote some discussion. My goal for this series is to make it as unlike Feminist Wrecked or SJW Destroyed compilations as I can. I'm not trying to be an edgy comedian and entertain you, though I'm always happy when people find my content entertaining or engaging. I'm trying to share with you as much interesting or important information as I can gather on the topic of intersectionality and postmodern theory as I can get. My working title for this series is A Quick Peek with number one Marmaduke fan. With that, this is a quick peek at A Century of Genocide in the Americas, the Residential School Experience, a short film by Rosemary Gibbons and Dax Thomas for Native Voices. First observation, this is an artistic documentary, which means it uses music, reenactments, and artistic film techniques to create an emotional effect. You're supposed to feel for the native speaking. It begins by describing educational programs by the Canadian government, which hired Roman Catholics, Anglicans, the United Church, and Methodists to educate Native American children. The male narrator, Sequitsik-Il, from the St'át'imc Nation, located in British Columbia, relates a story from his cousin about how the transportation to these Christian schools could itself be traumatic. Usually there were uncomfortable conditions, and they went through dangerous territory and weather. A female narrator quotes Article 2 of the 1948 Genocide Convention to define genocide. The implicit argument is that by transporting children from Native American groups to these schools, the Canadian government was participating in a genocidal action. For example, they point to Nicholas Flood Davin, who is a member of the Conservative Party of Canada in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Il claims that Davin visited the United States and introduced the concept of residential schools to the Canadian government as a solution to the Indian problem, essentially compulsory assimilation. They quote an unnamed Assiniboine child. In keeping with the promise to civilize the pagan, they went to work and cut my braids, which, incidentally, according to the Assiniboine traditional custom, was a token of mourning. The closer the relative, the closer the cut. After my haircut, I wondered in silence if my mother had died. Il argues that Christian ministries were an attempt to forcibly assimilate Native Americans. Quote, an elder told me that when they'd done this, that our people were looking up and praying, and they were taking the resources from underneath. Close quote. In other words, he sees Christian gospel ministries as part of the forced assimilation process for the purpose of stealing resources, which is being presented as a form of genocide by the filmmakers. According to the filmmakers, First Nations children were forcibly taken from their families from 1861 to 1984. Ill argues that these institutions were essentially soul-crushing, where harsh school discipline was used to rob the children of their native culture. He also argues that sexual abuse commonly occurred in residential schools and cites a case from 1988 where a teacher at St. George's Residential School was arrested and prosecuted with over 500 charges of sexual abuse against young boys. The documentary shows this statistic. It is estimated that 94% of all Indian children in residential schools were sexually abused, and in some cases, up to 100%. However, they do not provide a source, nor do they discuss how this statistic was estimated, so I have no way of confirming this. Ill introduces himself and describes himself as a survivor of the Campbellton Residential School. Ill believes that former students of residential schools need to reestablish their cultural roots with their tribes and find healing, not just from sexual abuse, but also from the process of assimilation. He argues that the oppressed can become the oppressor, with sexual abuse becoming more common within Native American tribes. He believes that sexual abuse in these tribes is a legacy of Christian teachers in particular and of Western civilization in general. Ill wants tribes to use spiritual means to promote a healing process. Participation in pre-colonial religious practices is seen as both a form of physical and emotional recovery, and a sort of opposition to what Ill sees as the forced Christian religious beliefs of Western civilization. The documentary concludes with footage of a healing ceremony and special thanks to the individuals who provided testimony. Here are my thoughts and concerns. While it is true that a higher percentage of victims of child abuse grow up to themselves become abusers, by arguing that child sexual abuse in Native American tribes is the fault of Western colonialism, I think Ill is diminishing the individual responsibility of Native American sexual abusers by casting the blame on something else, Western society, the residential school system. I believe that the rights of parents to educate their children as they see fit, whether it be homeschooling or a private school that reflects their religious beliefs, should be recognized as a sacred human right. Government-mandated education in a government-run institution necessarily robs parents of the power to educate their children as they see fit, and I would prefer to see more homeschooling, more private education, and other kinds of schools funded by local and religious communities as an alternative to total government control over children's education. However, based on the presentation of the argument in A Century of Genocide, it seems that Ill and his organization go beyond merely criticizing compulsory education and sexual abuse in residential schools. They are arguing that Christianity and Western education itself are tools of the Western oppressor. I do not know whether or not Ill would agree if there is a huge difference between voluntary assimilation and voluntary conversion to Christianity and compulsory assimilation and compulsory conversion to Christianity. Based on the presentation in this documentary, it seems that any natives who convert to Christianity are viewed as having abandoned their true cultural religion in favor of the Western oppressor's religion. Because native religious practices are held up as the healing process from colonialism, there doesn't seem to be room for a Native American who voluntarily converts to Christianity or voluntarily wishes to assimilate to Western civilization by learning English, for example. While I think that the criticisms of mandatory government education are fully deserved, I think the framework of Western oppressor and Native oppressed is ultimately harmful because it requires its own kind of religious assimilation to one way of thinking and living. I want individual Native Americans to be able to make choices as individuals for what schools they want to have their children attend, what religious practices they wish to engage in, and to be free to assimilate into the Western culture if they so choose. If someone chooses to assimilate to the Western culture, I don't think that individual choice should be held against them. I don't think one needs to assimilate to Western culture in order to convert to Christianity, but I do think that there is a parallel. They should be just as free to convert to Christianity as to choose not to convert. My concern with the intersectional framework is that it robs individuals of this choice by emphasizing its opposition to the Western society. That's all for today. Let me know what you think of my series, A Quick Peek, and let me know if there are other things you'd like me to take a peek at for future videos in this series. With that, I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys. We are so uncut on this channel, I can't believe it. Love you, catch you later.